Good afternoon, everybody. How are we today? Good, I hope, although I don't care that much. I wrote a piece that was published in the past 24 hours or so at Unheard, UNHERD, the British publication that I've been contributing to over the past few months. And I wanted to just elaborate on some of the themes here. And I thought that in service of doing that, I can kind of fill you in on the thought process that resulted in me writing this particular piece in this particular way. Now, the initial prompt, or the thing that I had wanted to explore or elucidate, was why, in the aftermath of these riots, such as the one that occurred recently in Kenosha, you have these farcical episodes where major media outlets like CNN, the New York Times, etc., end up almost literally at times describing scenes that feature blazing, raging infernos as largely peaceful. Like there was a screenshot of a CNN news report where the correspondent is sitting there with his little dopey microphone, and on the Chiron, Chiron, whatever you call the little text at the bottom of the TV screen as the CNN correspondents or pundits are prattling away, that read largely peaceful or mostly peaceful. And meanwhile, in the background, the guy is reporting on a scene where there is an enormous fire, meaning stuff had been lit on fire. It was an arson attack. So how do you square, and the New York Times did something similar in their initial dispatch where the rioting was declared mostly peaceful. Now, how do you square that? How does that even make sense just from a purely rationalistic perspective? And I know nobody is purely rational, but if you're walking down the street and you happen across a block of storefronts and 75% of them are on fire and you are surrounded by destruction, is your initial reaction going to be to say, oh, what happened here is mostly peaceful? No, I don't think so. So the question is, what is driving this obfuscation or that reaches well beyond any ordinary bounds of absurdity? And the easy explanation, I think, is to simply say that the journalists and editors and pundits and whoever else is involved in crafting this coverage simply have a bias in favor of downplaying the severity of riots, mostly because they feel that to do so would somehow advantage Trump politically, and they can't have that. Now, is that a factor? Sure. It's a factor. I don't think anybody is confused about who the media, by and large, supports in terms of the 2020 election. They're not particularly enthused about Joe Biden per se, but, you know, they like the ticket with Kamala on there, and regardless, the identity of the Democrat isn't particularly relevant if it means getting Trump out. That is the overriding prerogative in their minds. And of course, I'm generalizing, but sometimes you have to generalize when you're talking about multi-dimensional phenomena such as the U.S. media. But I think it would be a mistake to reduce the factors giving rise to this obfuscation to mere reflexive partisanship. Or it's just that the journalists skew liberal/left and therefore are more likely to be Democrats, whatever. I don't think that really captures it. And there's something distinct about the post-2016 era, about the Trump era, that goes well beyond the ordinary dynamics of partisanship. I mean, 20 years ago, the media mostly would have supported Democrats. But I think it would be ridiculous to say that the current political climate is just a mere extension of whatever was happening 20 years ago. So what is that difference in the larger climate? Well, it's something I think is unique to the Trump era, a thesis I've been developing now for years in fits and starts, is that 2016 represented a kind of epistemic rupture in especially the elite culture making class. And when I say culture making, I'm saying that in terms of how it interfaces with politics, although it's not an easy distinction to be drawn necessarily. And so many of the premises which guided their conduct and thought pre-2016 went out the window. There was a rupture. There was a delineation point, and Trump was the accelerant of that. And that explains why people or activists or whomever operating under the guise of Antifa are held up as heroic, why they've achieved mainstream validation, because the theoretical underpinnings of the nature of the political climate now as opposed to 20 years ago is that many people, and not just many people out there in the populace, but many people in the upper echelons of the media and political class believe, as far as I know sincerely, maybe there are some cynics, I'm sure there are some cynics, but there is a widespread sincere belief that fascism is an accurate characterization of the current state of U.S. governmental affairs under the current occupant of the White House. Trump has ushered in a reign of fascism. And once you accept the premise that fascism truly is a correct depiction of the state of U.S. politics, then understandably, a whole new set of moral imperatives become operative. Who is pro-fascism? Are there some people who would actually use that terminology, meaning I am in favor of fascism? Yeah, but that's a tiny minority. Most people who are right-minded, who have any awareness of what happened in the 30s and 40s, who maybe have relatives, older relatives now, who've fought in World War II or something, fascism is anathema to them. Just that notion. So they don't ascribe to it overtly, but they get accused of being fascists constantly, even if they do things like supporting the Republican nominee for president, which roughly half of the electorate does every cycle. So they've expanded the terms of what constitutes fascism by leaps and bounds. And what does this do? It kind of imbues American political debate and rhetoric with this kind of elevated historical status. So if it's up to you to combat fascism, then you're on the cutting edge of history. You are a continuation of the, quote, resistance. Does that term ring a bell? Of occupied France in 1941 or what have you. Everything has come down to you. I mean, civilization rests on your shoulders. So it's not just partisanship. I mean, and again, I think that this premise is extraordinarily flawed. I think it's analytically inaccurate to say that 2020 United States bears any remote resemblance to 1941 France. I mean, it's preposterous. But a lot of people do genuinely think in these terms. If you feel you need to organize under the banner of Antifa and you get validation from mainstream pundits and journalists and operatives who liken your current anti-fascist activities to the invasion of Normandy. And I'm not even exaggerating. There's a guy, Matt Duss, who was a foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders, was affiliated with the Center for American Progress forever. I don't know what his current affiliation happens to be. I think it might still be with Bernie, but when the protests broke out recently, he said, oh, Antifa is just like U.S. soldiers in World War II invading Normandy. I mean, please, at some point, you would hope that people who just have a basic semblance of reasonability could step back and say, no, just because you're running around proclaiming yourself to be anti-fascist doesn't mean that you should be associated in any conceivable sense with U.S. soldiers fighting in World War II. For one thing, do you think U.S. soldiers fighting in World War II thought that their own country, by and large, was fundamentally fascist? I doubt it. I doubt many of them subscribe to anarchist ideology. Maybe you could find a few examples here and there, given mass conscription meant that people across the board were going to be drafted into military service. But, I mean, come on. For the most part, no, I don't think your typical U.S. soldier landing on the beaches of Normandy had anything in common in terms of worldview with the Antifa people running around in Portland right now. And to say so reflects something fundamentally askew in your sense of the world. But however flawed this impression may be, meaning of the fascism versus anti-fascism dichotomy, I don't think you can underrate how prevalent it is and how integral it is in organizing how perceptions have materialized of U.S. politics in the past 4 years. It's central. I mean, you now have people saying that voting for Joe Biden ought to be viewed through the prism of a popular front because the ultimate evil is clearly fascism as embodied by Trump, and therefore all criticisms one might have of Biden or his voting history or his record or his future plans is essentially irrelevant. And look, if it were true that fascism was currently being enacted on the order of how we generally think of fascism, meaning with the antecedent being in the 1930s, then that would make some degree of sense. Then it would then all distinctions in the political spectrum probably should be collapsed into this simple fascism versus anti-fascism binary, and whatever you think about Joe Biden would be largely irrelevant. And I think there are reasonable arguments to be made in favor of voting for Joe Biden. I'm going to get into that more as the election approaches. Doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to do it. I'm an undecided voter at this point. Isn't that special? But this idea that Joe Biden is our bulwark against fascism seems nuts. Because again, it all comes back to whether you accept the basic premise that fascism is an accurate description of what's going on today in the U.S. And it just is not. Or if it is, then we really need to evaluate what your conception of fascism is. And we need to assess if it can be reasonably attached to the notion of fascism as is popularly understood, which derives from the 1930s. So an element of my working thesis is that the fascism versus anti-fascism dichotomy has become so popular because if you're an anti-fascist, then you can engage in pretty much whatever conduct you'd like. And you're never going to exist on the same moral plane as the fascists because the fascists are the ultimate evil. So all nuances get collapsed into this very morally absolute bifurcation. And so you can go burn down cities. You can attack journalists. You can call everybody and their mother a diehard, unflinching white supremacist. You can abandon journalistic standards, as was the case in the description of Blazing Inferno scenes as largely peaceful. All of that pales in comparison to what, per your framework, is the ultimate evil, the ultimate world historic civilization altering evil of, quote, fascism. And in that way, it's kind of self-absolving. It means you have this built-in justification to do whatever. So the main reason I would postulate for the widespread adoption of the fascism versus anti-fascism dichotomy is that it gives perceived license to anybody who wields the mantle of anti-fascism to engage in whatever it is that they would like to engage in. And they can do it with this sense of elevated historical importance. It's not about putting forth a reasonably accurate description of the current state of U.S. political and governmental affairs. Just because the world's largest and most powerful military isn't necessarily commanded by a fascist doesn't mean that there aren't problems with the current state of the national security apparatus and so on and so forth. It would be nice if we could have a reasonable, rational discussion about what ails the American political system, including the flaws of Trump, without necessarily always having to lapse into this catastrophizing, hair on fire, civilization teeters on the verge of collapse mode of rhetoric that tends to obscure more than it actually reveals. Mostly what it reveals is that lots of people who feel that they have an obligation to be politically engaged have some kind of void of meaning in their lives and fill that void with these exaggerated notions of their own historical significance. So, one thing I'm going to be doing as this election approaches is attempting to tamp down, not because I'm floating above it all and because I'm beyond any political passions and you plebes are just suckers who get yourself worked up over electoral politics, where I, this kind of enlightened snob, exist beyond that. No, I mean, I think it's worth it makes sense to have a stake in who the commander in chief of the world's most powerful military is. There are different things that happen given who that office is held by. But that doesn't mean that these incredibly incendiary, exaggerated, sometimes borderline mentally ill portrayals of the quote stakes of the election ought to be validated. They ought not to be. What ought to be encouraged is the most rational possible understanding of what the quote stakes of the election are and what they're not. Otherwise, all you're doing is incentivizing mass hysteria. And that mass hysteria is definitely evident across the political spectrum. All right, well, I hope that's an apt summation of the Unheard piece. I would encourage you to read it for yourself. And take a look also at other pieces published at that website. It's got a unique perspective, I would say. So, if you're the type who visits websites regularly to consume news or analysis, then I would say it's worthwhile to add that to your list. All right, gonna now scroll through and see if I have any super chats, perchance. Apparently not. I'm extremely offended. But that's okay. I can deal with it. All right, everybody, stay safe, stay cool, etc. And we shall speak again relatively soon. Bye-bye.